Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Managing Madrid Podcast. I'm your host, Kiyan Sobhani. Today we have a special guest. It's not going to be entirely Real Madrid related, but knowing me, knowing what this podcast is, I will try to twist it and turn it into a Real Madrid conversation as much as I possibly can. But today we have Ryan O'Hanlon making another appearance on the podcast, his first since his Los Angeles cameo during preseason, which was a lot of fun. Ryan O'Hanlon wrote this book called Net Gains, Inside the Beautiful Game's Analytical Revolution, and it's fascinating. I read this last year. Ryan, I can't remember exactly when you published it, but it was a few months ago that I actually finished reading it. I took a bunch of notes on it, and I wanted to ask you about this book ever since. So, first of all, welcome to the show, and congratulations on the success of publishing your first book.
Thank you. I appreciate that. October 18th of last year is when it came out.
Oh my God. Yeah, okay.
I only know that date exactly. Well, I know it exactly because it was an important day in my life because it's when I published my first book, but it was also at exactly a month before the World Cup started. So
I didn't realize it had been that long.
It's crazy that
it flew by.
Well, yeah, that's almost a year ago now, which I'm just realizing that that's almost a year ago now, and I might have an existential crisis on your pod. So
it's fine. Like I've said it many times. I feel like time has been a blur, especially since the pandemic. My concept of dates is all over the place. I don't remember exactly when it was when I saw you in Los Angeles. And time, it just everything moves so quickly. The news cycle, everything. So, when did you start writing the book?
It's a tricky question because there's multiple answers. I started thinking about the idea, honestly, the end of 2018, probably, which was kind of right around when like using numbers in writing about soccer wasn't becoming common, but I think like you guys were probably doing it on your site. I was working at the Ringer at the time, and I was doing a ton of it in my stuff. StatsBomb was publishing a bunch of stuff at that point. 538 was doing soccer stuff. So it felt like, I don't know, this is kind of right around when like Liverpool was starting to kick into gear too, and they're obviously one of the main, they're not really a protagonist in my book, but they're kind of one of the main drivers of all of this. So things were kind of coming together, it felt like, in 2018, especially after the World Cup. And then I left my job, worked on the proposal for a while with my agent, then finished it, kind of the proposal, like end of 2019. And then I don't know if you know, but there was a pandemic beginning of 2020, and people weren't really interested in buying books that weren't essentially either written by the then president of the United States or a person who was related to him, or like self-help books. So the market for like buying a book about soccer analytics cooled off for a little while, but then we eventually sold it around Thanksgiving 2020. So then basically from there, I kind of started writing it. And I basically had a year. First draft was due December 2021, and then edits, from there. We probably finished the copy for the most part by April of last year. So it's a pretty quick turnaround from when I actually started writing the book. A year is not that long. But it took a lot longer from the germination of the idea to when it got published.
Got it. So like it's funny because you also chose a niche to write about. Like if you had chosen to write a book called Cristiano Ronaldo versus Lionel Messi, the definitive decision, like it would have been like just a totally broader market. But you chose a very fascinating subject. I've always been interested in this because, I mean, now there's a lot. It's 2023. It's hard to say there's no one writing about analytics, as you said earlier on, because you were at Grantland as well before the Ringer, correct?
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot. I used to read a lot of basketball analytics at that time, be it on Grantland, later the Ringer, but also ESPN. I'm a huge fan of Zach Lowe. I love reading that kind of style of basketball writing. No one was really doing that for soccer. I think you were. I think Mike Goodman was. I'm sure there were a few others. You mentioned StatsBomb, but there was nothing like I always found it interesting, like the limited amount of people who were able to make analytics fun and readable and turn it into a story and paint a picture, there was not many people who could do that. There's just more people doing analytics. I think you could argue some of them are probably taking things out of context and not applying it the appropriate
Yes.
way, but it's definitely a very oversaturated thing now. Um, the reason I found your book really interesting is because you went far back, and talk not necessarily about the fan perspective and the fan use of analytics, but the way professionals are using it and how it's evolved over time. And I thought we could start all the way from the top. Name that I did not know this person existed until I read your book was Charles Reep. Can you explain who Reep was?
Yeah, so he was an accountant in the Royal Air Force in the UK during the two, I think both World Wars, and he kind of got into soccer. I think it was, I forget, it's either Herbert Chapman or one of the other Arsenal managers. As we said, my book came out a year ago, so I may have forgotten minor details, but one of the Arsenal managers showed up to the base that he was at. And the way he kind of described soccer made Charles Reep think of it as more of an intellectual pursuit. He hadn't really thought of soccer. He thought of soccer as it's a bunch of these like jocks running around and like banging into each other, and the way Herbert Chapman kind of talked about it from a strategic perspective got Charles Reep interested in it as a kind of intellectual pursuit. So he started going to games, and this is like before there was floodlights at stadiums. So he would go, or at least the stands wouldn't be lit up. So he'd go to these games and he'd have like a miner's helmet on his head, those ones with a little flashlight to light up his notebook. And he developed this shorthand, which I've seen copies of. I've actually seen actual copies of it, where he's essentially doing like what Opta does that we take for granted, right? Recording everything that happens with the ball in a game. And he developed this way to write it in his notebook, and he would go to the games and record everything that happened. And so he he was able to create like a data set with all of this information about what was happening in soccer games. And I think, interestingly, especially given what you mentioned about like lack of context, his whole thing was like, I don't want to count stuff just to count it. Like, who cares like the number of times this guy dribbled, right? He's like, I want to count all this to kind of try to understand how this sport works better, and ultimately try to figure out like what things you do on a field that help you win, right? So his kind of famous thing is that he found that most goals come from possessions of 3 or fewer passes, basically, while a much smaller percent come from longer possessions. So that he took that conclusion and was essentially like, all of these European teams that are so concerned with like emulating Brazil at the time, right? Because like the game wasn't as connected. So you would see teams play at a World Cup, and suddenly Brazil would be like passing the ball sideways, and it would be like, wait, you can do that? And he was like, these teams are just wasting their time. Like, they think it looks pretty and, whatever, but they're not increasing their chances of scoring. And he was like, we should just basically boot it up the field and chase after it, try to score, try to win it back, do it all over again. So his ideas, despite him being kind of an outsider, those ideas are very like masculine, I guess, kick it long, be strong, try to win the ball back, etc. So I think he was able to gain purchase within the game because the ideas that he came across through data were ideas that a lot of the British managers at the time wanted to be true, basically. So he started working at Watford, Wolves. Famously at Watford kind of shot up through all the divisions up to the first division. And Reep was kind of basically like the, data analyst who was like helping drive the way that Watford was playing under Graham Taylor. And Graham Taylor eventually became the England manager, and Charles Reep he didn't work for England directly, but I don't need to get into all of that controversy there. But essentially, Charles Reep's ideas sort of got all the way up to the English national team. And under Graham Taylor, England famously failed to qualify for the 1994 World Cup while playing a kind of kick and run style, as we referred to it in the States here when I was growing up. And so, to bring it full circle, the issue with Charles Reep's finding was that, yes, more goals came from shorter possessions, but longer possessions were more likely to lead to a goal. So it was kind of an issue of correlation versus causation. And he basically misread his data. So he became a kind of anathema to English soccer. There's tons of articles written about how he ruined English soccer, how his bad math kind of destroyed the direction of, the birthplace of soccer, if you want to agree, of football. And so that was kind of my conception of him. But then as I did some reporting for the story and met some people, my mindset about him kind of changed. So that's the general gist of him.
Well, it's interesting how much football has changed since then. I mean, not even like since 1994 when they failed to qualify, but even in the last, I'd say 5, 7, 10 years, it's changed so much. Yeah. And it's interesting because I think if this is a very unfair thing to do, but if I were to summarize your book, or at least come to a conclusion as with regards to what works, what is the best way to play football, which obviously still is subjective, is like, just create the most chances. Whoever creates the most chances, eventually the math adds up. You win the most, probably, right?
Yeah.
Of course, there's so much more that goes into it that we can discuss. But I did think it was interesting also that so many people who joined the analytical revolution in soccer, like Charles Reep, were not actually from a soccer background. Like, Luke Bornn appears later in the book as decades after Charles Reep, for example. I can't remember what was his background. Maybe we can start there. Who was Luke Bornn and what was his background?
Yeah, he's a fellow Canadian, actually.
Love it.
Well, not fellow for me, for you.
Yes.
So he was like he studied movement, basically. That's what he was interested in, how organisms, whether as groups or by themselves, like move throughout the world. And so he's educated out the ass, has every degree you could want, worked at Los Alamos. And, the example I use in the book, he worked on this problem where there's a problem with helicopters where if there was a hole in one of the propellers on the helicopter, it would not matter, like a bullet hole. The helicopter would be fine. And then if there were 2 bullet holes, same thing, helicopter would be fine. But if there's 3, the helicopter just falls out of the sky. And the issue with that is you don't know, because there's no there's no noticeable difference of what's happening. You don't know that the helicopter is like one hole away in the propeller from falling out of the sky. So he worked on this problem at Los Alamos, where trying to figure out how they could allow the pilot essentially to detect this issue. And I guess what they did is they put like tons of little sensors all over the helicopter. And what it found was that the vibration characteristics of the helicopter like changed ever so slightly. And so they were able to use that technology to create a kind of warning system, I guess, with the helicopters. And that technology has since been used to like monitor bridges, which are very similar. Like a bridge is fine until it collapses, basically, right? But there's a way where you can essentially like make a bridge vibrate ever so slightly, and the characteristics change enough where you can tell, oh, this bridge is actually very close to collapsing. We need to reassess the foundation and kind of strengthen it. So I only bring those up because those are very kind of important and difficult problems to solve. And Luke Bornn is now he's a co-owner of AC Milan, so he now is working in soccer and trying to figure out soccer. And he described like figuring out soccer, measuring soccer, determining what actually works as one of the hardest intellectual problems he's ever worked on. He got into sports because there was a data set of tracking data from an NBA game and he called it like the richest data set of movement he'd ever seen. It has like takes millions of pictures per second, has the location of the ball and all the players at all times. So he just was fascinated by that and started, studying the NBA, kind of became one of the leading sort of analytical minds in the NBA, eventually worked for the Sacramento Kings. And then from there, I think he kind of saw that soccer was a pretty ripe and potentially lucrative area for someone of his expertise. So he first worked for Roma. He was like their director of analytics back in when Roma made the semifinals of the Champions League. Actually, when was that? 2018. And it's funny, like I knew he was working there, and I'm thinking, oh, like this is it. Like especially when Roma and Liverpool played, it was like, finally like smart teams are like winning. Like this is amazing. And then I talked to Luke, and he was like, yeah, I had no effect on anything. He was like Luciano Spalletti, the then manager. He's like, he would buy me a bunch of, he'd make me espressos every day, but he wouldn't give a shit about any of the analytical findings that I revealed to him. So then Luke went to the Kings, and then from there he actually teamed up with Billy Beane, the Moneyball hero, and they first bought Toulouse in France. Got them promoted relatively quickly. Toulouse actually just won the French League Cup this past season. And then a year ago, they were part of a group that took over AC Milan, and now they're running AC Milan.
Well, I think it's really interesting because the reason I brought up that, Luke Bornn and Charles Reep, they didn't come from soccer backgrounds. To me, what I understood from reading the book was that what Bornn was doing in a lot of ways is trying to solve a sport that hasn't been solved in the way other sports have been. Like when we look at basketball, it's, and maybe there is never going to be 100% clear this is the way and this will always be the way. The sport always evolves and the truth always changes. But in basketball, there are 5 players. In soccer, there are 11 players, and a lot of them have wildly different functions in the team. There are so many moving parts. There's 90 minutes. There's, we can come up with the idea like, okay, we need to create the most chances. And then the discussion is you have to peel it back. How do we create the most chances? Where does this player need to move? What are like the moving pieces in the build-up? And of course, Busquets comes into the book, like I think halfway through or 3/4 of the way through, as someone like, okay, this guy is not like the person you would think about in terms of creating the most chances, but then you outline like his importance, for example. But I think the non-soccer background of Bornn and Reep, maybe more so in Bornn's case, although he has had a lot of success, is convincing people who grew up in the sport, played professionally, coached professionally, to like take their nerdy analytical stuff seriously. Whereas it seems like a lot of the coaches that he worked with were dismissive of like, okay, where does intuition come in? Where does feeling come in? Where does instinct, like you, for example, like I have to shoehorn as many Real Madrid things in this as I possibly can, but like, would you like Ancelotti's philosophy of like, I would never tell Modric what to do. I would never tell Zidane what to do, because these guys are the ones who decide the game, not, no like analytics is going to tell me otherwise. So it almost seemed like Bornn had success with maybe some of the smaller teams. And of course there's FC, I don't know how to pronounce him, Michelin, who had an incredible amount of success using analytics. But it almost seems like the higher you go up the totem pole, the harder it is to convince, teams like that. So I don't know. Would you say that's an accurate kind of assessment?
No, it's definitely accurate. And it's accurate in part because it's like, Real Madrid, it's like, what does it even mean to convince like Real Madrid to do something, right? Like you have Florentino Perez, and then you have like this whole bureaucracy of people that affect decisions at the club, right? So it's like, it's like a soccer clubs, like I think we sometimes oversell how much money these teams make. If you look at a Fortune 500 company compared to like Real Madrid's revenue, it's not even close. But like these are big institutions, right? And it's not like convincing one person is going to get you as far as it might at one of these smaller clubs, or at one of these smaller clubs where like Brighton and Brentford, for example, are two very analytically savvy teams. And
Mm.
they're just owned by two guys that used to be professional sports bettors. So they bought the teams, and then now they're like, guess what? This is how we're doing things, right? Like that's the easiest way
Yeah.
to affect change. And that's why buying AC Milan is potentially a way to make that happen. But yeah, it's true. I mean, it's interesting, right? It's like, you mentioned Real Madrid, and I think one of the things you learn is I think one of the things with like analytics in sports is, yes, there's like better ways to try to play, right? Obviously in the NBA, if you have the best team but you don't shoot any threes, you're not going to win, right? Like you're just not going to be able to score enough points. In baseball, same thing. Like if you're bunting with your best player like every inning, and there's, and same with the NFL, right? If you have the Chiefs have Patrick Mahomes, if they were just running every like 80% of the time, they wouldn't be as good. So there are tweaks you can make. But ultimately, I think most of the people that work kind of in this space would say that one of the kind of analytical tenets of sports is like we don't put enough value on the players. Like the most important, the people who win the games are the players. And yet, as people that kind of watch who aren't players, I think we tend to give all this credit to these great tactical ideas that these various coaches have, as if they're kind of like using a remote control and like telling the players where to move throughout the game. I think what did Mikel Arteta recently said that Arsenal played like 45 formations against Manchester City, which is just absurd. But with that, analytics is almost like, it's a broad term, but like what like Luke would say, he's the most important part of his job is trying to find better players for his team, right? And then kind of from there, everything works. And that's kind of the whole Real Madrid story. It's that, yeah, you just find all the best players and you maybe don't even worry that much about like how you're organizing them. And it tends to work out, I think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, and that's the difference because like FC Midtjylland was looking at like if they wanted to buy a striker, they would actually look at someone who was underperforming their XG and be like, well,
Yeah.
that's not going to be sustainable for him to miss those chances. That's just bad luck. So we'll just get him. He's undervalued, and lo and behold, like that'll eventually normalize. Like I don't think Real Madrid is. I mean, like I'd be curious to know if you were able to find out anything about Real Madrid and how they use data, like compared to a team like Liverpool, who obviously are probably one of the forerunners of the big clubs. But yeah, I don't think Real Madrid are looking at necessarily the fact that Bellingham is first in Bundesliga and successful take-ons. And, like Matt, one of our writers, wrote an article this week on Managing Madrid about the fact that we don't have a striker and that we actually have three of the best dribblers in Europe, Bellingham, Vinicius, and Rodrigo. Analytically speaking, these guys like all the 99th percentile. We can create so many chances and it may not matter. I don't know if Real Madrid are thinking that way. Like I don't think they are. I think they're like, okay, we couldn't get Mbappe. I guess we're gonna run it back with Bellingham and see what happens. Like, so. But were you able to get anything about Real Madrid in this? Any information on that?
I don't know anything about Real Madrid in particular. I mean, it is interesting that I mean, like that Eden Hazard signing obviously was terrible. And I think a lot of, that's just like not a signing you would make if you were being run by some like analytical director of football, right? If like Michael Edwards, will say, was running Real Madrid. But other than that, right, it's like even like Luka Jovic was like, it ended up being kind of a bust, but like he had really good underlying numbers and was
Yeah.
pretty young. But I guess that was kind of more at the era before we all started realizing that like the Bundesliga numbers can get pretty inflated for certain players.
Mm.
But after that, it's like, I don't know. It's like Kamavinga, Chouameni, like these are all like young players with not that many question marks about their game. And that is a shift in the way Real Madrid are acquiring players, right? I mean, obviously, like even the last era of Real Madrid, I was going to say Modric, but he's on the team, but the Ronaldo era, most of those players joined the team when they were 24 or younger, right? They weren't signing any of those guys when they were
Yeah.
28, and that's why the team was so good for so long. So I would be shocked if there wasn't some kind of data analysis that's being done there. But I think like going toward younger players that you can have for a really long time is in some ways like an analytical idea. And like all of these guys do have like, I don't know the last time they, like maybe in the past, like Real Madrid would have tried to sign like Dusan, like Vlahovic or someone like that, who had like a lot of goals one season, but like there's a kind of a lot of question marks about where those goals came from and other things that he did. And now they're just like that type of player. I feel like they're not really ever in the market for those guys, or I don't hear about that anymore, which is
Yeah.
suggests that there's something changed behind the scenes, right?
Well, since the disastrous Hazard and Jovic deals, I hope there was. It seems like there's been a shift to be like, okay, because we haven't really seen anything disastrous since then. I'm really
Yeah.
glad we got to see Vlahovic at Juve for another year to kind of see like, okay, maybe this guy wasn't as good,
Yeah.
and maybe that's unfair to him because Juve were a mess. But I certainly wouldn't have signed him. But I did. This kind of goes back to something you said in the book that I had pulled up here. Uh, and again, like maybe Real Madrid, like there's no real reason. For example, if for example you want to sign Erling Haaland, no one needs to do a deep dive on his analytics, right? You guys just like, okay, it's Erling freaking Haaland, you sign him. And I was
Yeah.
gonna say maybe you do that for the younger players, but like even Vinicius and Rodrigo, what advanced analytics could you really dig up from 6 months in Brazil, right? That tiny
Yeah.
sample size in a different league on another continent. I think at that point you're just betting on the eye test at that point. Um, but you did write in your book about Toulouse's success. You said one of Toulouse's first clear analytically inclined strategies was simply to get younger. Research suggests that performances for players in the top 5 European leagues tends to peak somewhere between the ages of 24 and 28, with minor differences by position. Center backs and goalkeepers tend to peak a couple of years later, whereas wide attackers tend to peak a year or two earlier. Uh, and one simple way to improve performance then in trying to pack your team with players toward the beginning of their peak years. And that's exactly what Bornn did in that situation. And I think that's what Real Madrid have been doing, really.
Yeah.
Or betting like maybe even younger than that, but they've been trying to rely on market opportunities and younger players who are just about to hit that threshold, which makes sense to me. And it was kind of nice to read that. I'm like, okay, well, this strategy. I kept saying all summer I would have signed Kane, but when I read things like that, I'm like, okay, well, at least there seems to be some kind of method to the madness here.
Yeah, totally. And there are obviously, it seems like there's a growing amount of super athletes like in all sports, right? Guys that are just continuing to be like really, really good in their 30s, mid 30s, late 30s, in a time where like you would think the level of competitiveness would make it even harder to do that. Because, people are always like, oh, well, we have like health techniques that like extend players' careers, but then it's like we also have all these techniques that should make all the younger players like more athletic too. So like shouldn't those things cancel out? So that is happening, and I think it's happening with soccer. Benzema becoming like having all of his best seasons in his 30s. Obviously, some of that was situational, but I don't think it was totally situational. Um, Modric is still, he's playing much more limited minutes load, but even when he plays still, he's amazing. Even with like Liverpool, they signed Salah like in his late 20s to a massive contract, and he never gets injured and looks pretty good still.
Yeah.
So I think that there are those players too. And I guess when you're Real Madrid, you have the luxury of being able to afford those handful of guys that are really good in their 30s, and then you can pair them with all of these younger stars that you have. But yeah, I think it's like for a team like Madrid, like using data, it's almost like a way to like it's most useful almost in a way to avoid like making a big mistake, right? Rather than like figuring out exactly which wide forward you need to sign. Because it's just do Mbappe and Holland if you can get both of them, and if not, you get the guy from Napoli or whatever. So
Yeah. I I think it's interesting too that I don't know if you actually came out right and said it, but just kind of reading it and going over the chapters, I kind of came to the conclusion that there is that a lot of people feel that there is quite a degree of luck in football, which I don't think is untrue. But I did think, and I didn't know this part, although I watched Moneyball, um, that uh, Billy Bean, who obviously is the star of the movie Moneyball, and it's a true story. When it came to the playoff games, he really felt like it was just a coin toss. So he wouldn't watch. He would go out in the back. He would work out. He would eat. He would do whatever, and then kind of just see where the coin had landed at the end. Did his team win? Did his team not? Um, and of course, like I have so many notes on your book now. I'm trying to I have trouble finding the exact page, but you mentioned somewhere that something that works in the playoffs, something that works in the regular season rather, doesn't necessarily work in the playoffs. Why do you think that is? Is it a matter of teams taking playoffs more seriously? It's better scouted. Like why is that?
yeah, I mean, so in baseball, like that's the sport that's like the most solved, I guess, and the work publicly and privately that's being done on baseball is like so far advanced from what's happening in soccer. To the point where like honestly, if a Major League Baseball team makes like a weird decision, you should just like assume that like the thought process that went into it is so much more advanced than anything you could come up with that it's probably right. Um, and there's people are every year they look into, all right, is there anything that like correlates to postseason success that doesn't necessarily correlate as much to regular season success? And no one's really been able to find anything. And it's not a totally satisfying conclusion to just be like, it's just luck, like in baseball, it's a 162 game season. But like the best team in the league will frequently lose to the worst team in the league over a single game because that's just how baseball works. And so if that's true, maybe you get a couple of those games in the playoffs, right? And then all of a sudden you're the best team and you're out. And like the team with the most wins frequently, I don't know how often the team with the most wins the World Series, but it's definitely below 50% of the time, probably significantly below. So I think the main reason is it's just not that many games. So it's hard to like know what'll work at all, right? And I think the same is kind of true of soccer, right? Like it's
What is the
you're
playoffs of soccer? Like would it be like the Champions League knockouts? Like
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I would say the knockouts because the group stages are not they're just not that competitive, right? Because of the way the teams get separated. That it's not
Yeah.
like I think there's one group this year that'll be what is it? Newcastle, Dortmund, Milan, and someone else. That group will be
Yeah.
like every game will be pretty important, but most of the time that's kind of not how it goes. So I would say it's the knockouts, and I mean it's like yeah, it's like random stuff can decide one game, right? Like the did Grealish miss last year or 2 years ago, or did Mendy clear the ball off the line? I forget what happened. Or did both of those things happen?
Both of those, there were two separate instances. One is I think Mendy cleared one off the line, and Griezmann also had a shot I think saved by Courtois.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's just little things like that, right? Like Mendy clears the ball and maybe it deflects off someone else and then falls to a Manchester City's player's foot and it goes in, right? Um, Granted, and we've talked about this pretty much for like years now, as I've known you, Real Madrid, for whatever reason, seems to be the team that can deal with all of that random crap happening better than everyone else. But then at the same time, right? Like, how long did Real Madrid go without winning a Champions League? What was it, 30 something years
32
from,
years and then 12
yeah,
years. Yeah.
yeah. And like, I'm old enough to remember like the kind of like, the Fernando Torres, Steven Gerrard, like Andrea Dosena, Liverpool, like spanking Real Madrid in the Champions League, not that long ago.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I've been curious about like is there anything that makes a team more likely to win in the Champions League than, because Real Madrid is a prime example, right? Like, so they've won how many Champions Leagues?
14.
5, 4. Well, of course,
Oh,
14 overall. I
recently
mean,
5.
since 10, yeah, so
Yeah.
5, and they've basically won what, maybe 5 La Ligas over that same stretch.
Yeah.
And you would just assume they would have more La Ligas than Champions Leagues because you're just competing against Barcelona most of the time, right? And yet
Yeah.
they don't. And that's a lot of that is probably kind of just like random. And they probably had a couple years in La Liga where they were probably good enough to win La Liga and a couple things didn't go their way and they didn't win, right? But at the same time, it's like it's not a fully satisfying explanation even to me, that it would just kind of be random. I think randomness plays a much bigger part in soccer than anyone's willing to acknowledge. But at the same time, the figuring out the difference between what's kind of variance and what's a real thing that's happening, is interesting. And I don't know. Yeah, with like Madrid, it's just like, I don't know, they have amazing players, and like maybe their structure isn't as impressive as these other teams, but maybe because they don't have as impressive of a structure, the players are able to kind of just like figure things out in these high pressure moments and kind of meld together in these unexpected ways that like other teams aren't able to kind of understand because they're not used to facing those same kind of unexpected patterns. So yeah, I am kind of rambling here, but yeah, the Champions League is kind of I mean, the World Cup is the prime example, but that's,
Well, I think this part really fascinates me, and I I'll save it for the end of the podcast. But I'm curious to know if there was a sequel to this book, what it would look like, because I have some ideas for you, what to write about. I don't know if you're like one of those authors who are like, okay, now that I saw how brutal it is to write a book, I'm done, or are you going to keep going? But
I'm gonna keep going.
okay, cool. So I have some ideas for the next one, but I think like I drive my Barcelona fans nuts because we get into these debates about what's more important, Champions League or domestic trophies. And of course, I'm a Real Madrid fan, so I will, with bias, say Champions League. And they're Barcelona fans, so they will, without bias, say it's La Liga because it's the consistency over the years, etc. And I always say, like, that's cool that you guys win those games, but that's like the regular season. You guys, but when it comes to the big moments, we step up and you guys choke. And they don't really have an answer to that. And because we've seen it, like, it was like 8 years in a row where their style of football, a combination of they were scouted, their high line was exposed, and then also they just didn't show up. All their stars turned into ghosts. Whereas us, we would be complaining about our domestic form and how bad we're playing and how it's a mess. We're like 15 points behind the league. Then lo and behold, like these knockouts roll around and we're just winning and everyone shows up. Ronaldo's doing bicycle kicks, Bale's doing bicycle kicks. Everyone's going to, like, Modric just was like dribbling through 5 players and Benzema's, picking the ball off the goalkeeper. All these things happen with us. And I've always down, like, the luck side is, it's like, it's undoubtedly true that some of these things that happen are like can totally swing either in your favor or the other way. Like, I'm a basketball fan, right? So I'm a Raptors fan. That year when the Raptors won the championship and Kawhi Leonard hits the shot that bounces a million different ways at the buzzer and finally goes in against the Sixers, what if that ball actually bounces a millimeter outside the rim and doesn't fall? I feel like we probably would have lost that game in overtime to the Sixers. We're not winning the championship, and then we're not stumbling into the finals where Klay Thompson, all of a sudden, Kevin Durant is, blowing out their Achilles, and we win the championship. But you have to, like, go back all the way to, like, this ball bouncing 5 times on the rim at the buzzer and winning in unbelievable fashion. And you think back to Real Madrid's 2022 Champions League run, there was. Now, this part is not luck to me because, like, I often bring up Courtois saving Messi's penalty in the first leg of the round of 16.
Yeah.
That, I don't know if that's luck, but I think that has to be considered talent of your goalkeeper, right? Even when with Courtois having the game of his life in the final against Liverpool, or having the game of his life against Manchester City, like that all counts. I don't think that's luck. I think that's you have to at least respect Courtois in that situation to be like, this guy's a genius. You replace Courtois with any other random goalkeeper, I don't think Real Madrid are winning the Champions League that year. But I think this discussion of luck also goes too far sometimes. Like when we say, okay, like we won one Champions League with Zidane, people call it lucky, and then you win 2 and then 3. Like at that point, like, come on, guys, 3 in a row, come on, like that's over, and then 4 and then 5. Like at some point, we have to factor something else in here. I don't know how to measure it. I don't know, like, and this is what I was talking about, like the net gains sequel, because Real Madrid barely came up in this book, and like, what's the next, like, how do we measure like the psychology of a big moment? Like when, like, some players can just slow their heart rate down, and I think some players don't do that as well. I don't know how to measure that. I don't know how to even analyze that. I don't know where that comes into play, because this is something different than analytics, if that makes sense. I'm having trouble verbalizing.
No, I know exactly what you're talking about. I know exactly what you're talking about. So there's like a difference between individual and collective behavior, like in science. And with soccer, right, it's not, even if you got really good at figuring out how many goals above average each player is worth over the course of a season. Let's say you get all this tracking data, you figure out how each action on the field is worth. You figure out, like, okay, Tchouaméni's positioning here throughout the game is, preventing these passes, so we'll give him like half a goal prevented per game or whatever. Even if you do that really well, I don't think it would just be you add up all of the Real Madrid players and then how good the team is, right? It's about how good their players are, but then it's about how the players are interacting on the field, both in terms of how their strengths and weaknesses, amplify each other or hurt each other, or whether their qualities are like worth like an exponential value where they're multiplying, or you just add up their values. And then also how they just like, there's like all this research into how different animals and organisms like work together, and like frogs will be able to like sync their heartbeats together basically, and like make noise at the same time. So like, why couldn't something like that happen with a soccer team, right? Like I was saying, like Real Madrid. I mean, I wrote a piece about this before the Champions League final. I talked to this woman, Jessica Flack, who works at the Santa Fe Institute, which is this college in Mexico where they do kind of really intense, interesting research. And she's like a collective computing expert. And I kind of raised a bunch of these ideas to her about, like, you get this team and like the players talk about like how important it is to play for Real Madrid, and after every game, like we weren't going to lose because we're Real Madrid. And like, I was like, could them just talking about this and saying it, even players that will say it after they've been on the team for like 2 weeks, right? I was like, could that allow them to like summon an ability to perform in like brief moments throughout a game in a way? Because like, if Real Madrid, like, let's take like the Man City game, end of the Man City 2 years ago, where they kind of just like suddenly were like good for 3 minutes basically. And after, like, even I remember you guys, might have been you or it was the Managing Madrid account. I remember this, that one of you tweeted like, yeah, they're just better than us, like we'll get them next year basically, before the game was over. And then
which one was that, City or PSG?
City.
Okay.
And then they scored 3 goals after your account tweeted that. And like, if Madrid was able to summon that sort of concentrated high level of performance for 90 minutes, like all the players would probably like die of heart attacks or something, and they would like win every game 100-0. So maybe there's a thing where like they kind of have to be a little more passive for a lot of the game, and like allow chances to then be able to like summon this collective movement in these moments where they can't summon it until like they're under duress, right? Where it's like, okay, we have to score. We now know we have to score here. So here's, this give and go and this outside of the foot pass that no one was seeing. And this guy also made this run that no one had made all game, and suddenly we score. So I think like there's all kinds of stuff like that. I don't know how you would measure it. The woman talked about like wanting like brain sensors on players like during games, so you could understand like what's happening mentally, to see if there is some kind of like connection across all the players versus kind of just, well, this is just random. But yeah, I mean, I don't know, it's interesting. The thing I always think about with all this stuff is like, this is all true, and even like what you were saying about Barcelona, Real Madrid, that was all true. But then also like, I don't know, a lot of the huge games in La Liga during that era, Barcelona would like show up against Real Madrid. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, so that is also kind of strange too. So I don't know. I think it's all really interesting. I think that what you're saying, like, that is definitely like a frontier for trying to understand the sport better, especially soccer, because it is so dynamic, and it's all about having really good players, but then it's all about like the interactions between those players and how those things happen.
Yeah, well, that's what makes it so hard to measure, because sometimes it's about momentum too, and what each team is going through. So, for example, when Real Madrid were getting outplayed by PSG for a game and a half, that second half of the second leg, everyone was like, that's why I asked you, was that tweet about City or PSG? Because at halftime against PSG, everyone was like, these guys are just better than us. Like, we're, running back next year, make some signings. And then what happened was, it was like two polar opposite sides of the coin, where Real Madrid are able to play with their backs against the walls and flip the switch. Whereas PSG had the opposite problem for years, where it's like, if one thing happens, you're like, oh, it's happening again. We're choking. Yeah. That's all it took. And you think, but this wasn't always the case. Like you mentioned, that 2009 Liverpool game versus Real Madrid, for years it was the opposite. We were choking in the round of 16. We had multiple round of 16 eliminations. And you also think back to Ramos's header against Atletico in the 93rd minute. Like I often think about, what happens if he doesn't score that header what does that mean for the next 5 years? Like, I don't know. Like, that's a huge.
And then it's like they finished third that season in La Liga, right?
Something so like that.
Like,
yeah.
Then it's like, what do we even have to show for this season? And then that goes in, and then obviously things go well in extra time, and then it's like, oh, we've got 10, and now here's we're going to win 4 more over the next 6 years or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good point.
I do think there was one thing that, I mean, there are many things, I think, to be fair, but like one thing that you can look at as something that happened in the second half of the second leg of all those ties in that run was that Real Madrid brought in like 5 players off the bench who were all young and energetic. Mm-hmm. And then I think that caught the opponents off guard, in the sense that we had been sitting deep for the majority of the tie. Then all of a sudden we started pressing with young legs. And that was, from a tactical perspective, was something that I think caught everyone off guard in that moment. And it flipped the momentum a little bit. And I remember asking Ancelotti about this at Stamford Bridge last year, which of course we didn't win the Champions League last year. City beat us in the semifinal, but at Stamford Bridge, it was that weird game where Frank Lampard played Conte as basically a striker, and it was actually giving us all kinds of problems, right? And they were like pressing and stuff, and Ancelotti said like, well, I asked him about this, like I was like, so what happened in the second half that you were able to, ultimately overturn it and get out of your half? And he said, yeah, we knew that Chelsea were going to press, and did that. We also knew they weren't going to sustain it, and we had subs. And I was like, well, that was like kind of like the plan for all of these games, was like, let's just let them press us, we'll ride it out, and then we'll bring on subs, and then we know they'll be drained. Obviously, once they got to the Etihad in the second leg, that we just got dominated. But they were. there were different ways that Ancelotti tried to combat it either way, but
Yeah,
now we're deviating. There's from net
it's
gains
fine.
and analytical
It's okay.
revolution. But I know we only have a few minutes left. I did want to ask you. I'm trying to think of what to prioritize now. Javier Fernandez, I think is his first name was Javier, right? The Barcelona
Yes,
guy.
yes.
Um, can you talk about him? Just give the listeners introduction to him.
Yeah, so he's this Chilean, I guess, data scientist, but that probably undersells how accomplished he is, who eventually started working for Barcelona, and I guess he became essentially the head of analytics in Barcelona. And I don't know if you've I feel like I'm not seeing him as much, but there's like the Barca or Barca Innovation Hub, this big thing that they've been talking about for the past 10 years. And so Javier works for Barcelona, is a genius guy when it comes to soccer and kind of trying to measure what's happening and figure out what's happening on the field. And I wanted to talk to him, one, because he's really smart, but also two, like he was working for Barcelona like as the decline for Barcelona began, right? And so in my head, I'm like, okay, they got this like brilliant guy they hired to kind of help them make better decisions, I guess, ultimately, right? Is what this is all kind of geared toward. And why did that coincide with the team getting worse? And then, you talk to them and you find out, well, you know, the teams are really only listening to these people kind of as like, one, they're asking these people to like measure things in training or in games that like maybe aren't the best things to be measured. But you have to do it if the manager asks you. And then two, you're, like you said earlier, like you're a Chilean data scientist. Like I'm a guy that's played at La Masia growing up, and now I'm like the assistant coach of Barcelona. Like, what are you going to tell me? But when he pointed out that like sometimes some of the stuff he would study would find that, oh, maybe we want to like be more aggressive with our passing kind of here, or we want to target this player who isn't as sort of secure on the ball, but he's very aggressive and he kind of is able to make um, all this really interesting stuff happen up the field, which outweighs the fact that maybe he's going to lose the ball more than you would want for your typical tiki-taka Barcelona player, and that he'd get a lot of pushback from those ideas. And I think you can kind of envision it, right? Yeah, Barcelona, when he comes in, they've been pretty much incredibly successful almost the entire time. Um, they ushered in this new era of soccer, and he's coming in, has no soccer background, and is also like, well, what do you think about like these? What do you think about like hitting a long ball in these situations rather than trying to pass it back to the keeper? And you can sort of see how hard that would be for someone like that to get any of their ideas across, but you can also see how kind of that closed-minded mentality is part of what led Barcelona to the situation they're currently in.
Well, I guess you kind of answered it, but I was going to ask, like, what do you think, how much influence he actually had? I often think back to, like, the Griezmann signing and how, really,
Yeah,
when you
that's
think about it, if you
that's
have
the
such a
Hazard
great,
signing
yeah, it's their
for
Hazard
Barcelona.
signing. If you have such a great mind in your analytics department, you have all this tech available to you, what good does it do if you're just going to assign uh I guess an inferior version of Messi in the same position.
Yeah, or
I don't.
like all the from after they won the Champions League, that array of like Andre Gomez and Dennis Suarez and
Mm,
Luca Digne, that just like all of these players that were just like not cheap and also just like are so not at the level required to compete for the Champions League every year. And they pretty much made a terrible signings for like 4 years in a row, basically. And those are like all kind of signings, right? That are like the guys weren't even that young. And then there was like, I guess they were able to sell a bunch of them, but like, I don't know. They're like the signings where like the upside is minimal and the downside is also high, because like you're paying like 50 million for Andre Gomez when like the best case scenario is that he's a $50 million player. So those are also we're all kind of like just moves you wouldn't be making if you were kind of thinking more aggressively about like how, how many goals are these signings going to add to our team? How many goals are they going to prevent and stuff like that?
Yeah. Well, it's also interesting, like with Fernandez and his ideas. If you look at how much Pep has changed his style of play
Yeah.
since then, I would say maybe you could argue Fernandez was right in that situation. I mean,
Oh, he was
Pep is
definitely right.
yeah, Pep is quite fluid in the way like his ideas now, and I think it's
You
changed
saw
quite a bit.
last year.
Yeah.
It's all like gigantic guys, basically, like to completely oversimplify it. It's playing almost four center backs at the same time. Rodri is massive. De Bruyne is huge for an attacking midfielder. Haaland's a shithouse. Grealish isn't tall, but his legs are like the size of like two fire hydrants. So it's like Gundogan and Bernardo Silva surrounded by and Bernardo's like a freak athlete, right? He has incredible endurance. Um, and yeah, even the Arsenal game last year, like a couple of City's goals came from like long balls to Haaland. He knocks it down to De Bruyne, and then they score. So Pep's ideas have changed a lot, and even City doesn't really. They're like encouraging teams to get on the ball more and to come into their defensive third, which like the Barcelona and Bayern era Peps was like, if the team crosses midfield, we've failed,
Right.
So very different now.
Yeah, very different. And I think it's interesting that when you read the book, there's also obviously different teams have found different ways to create more chances than your opponents. I mean, like transition opportunities are one of those ways where you can have
Yep.
20% of possession but having higher XG than your opponent if you play your cards right. I also thought, and again, I couldn't find it. I have so many notes on your book. I don't remember exactly what page or what context it was, but someone had come up with the idea that why don't we just kick the ball away, like intentionally give the ball away to them so that we can just win it back from them in a more dangerous area. Like why waste our time building up? Let's just give it to them and then press them and score goals. And I can't remember, maybe you don't remember off the top of your head who it was that came up with that, but
Yeah, well, that's sort of the Charles Reep like general idea that he had, and
mm,
then it's been made modern more by like the Red Bull gegenpressing approach, which is in some ways is based on data, where it's like this guy Ralf Ragnick, who was last seen being the manager of Man U for half a season, but
yeah,
he kind of developed the Red Bull sporting identity, and he found research that found like the best time to score a goal is within 8 seconds of winning the ball back. And, from there you build out, okay, that means we want to win the ball high up the field because we're closer to the goal. It'll be easiest to move it to the goal. And if we're premising our game on being really quick attacking when we win the ball back high up the field, that encourages us to be more aggressive when we have the ball because we're kind of building our identity around losing the ball. So it's like that encourages the teams to play or try to just play a bunch of aggressive through balls, right? Like the kind of almost the FIFA style where you press triangle or whatever, and then it doesn't work, come off, and then you swarm the guy with the ball and then you try it again because you know that you're like the best at the moments when you lose the ball. And so that's kind of where the whole Red Bull thing came around. But then there's the idea of like that's a good strategy for a lot of teams. And I think pretty much all sports, right? Like more aggressive strategies are kind of probably always just the best ones over the long haul. Um, that's just kind of what we've seen. And I think there's no reason to think soccer wouldn't hold true in that regard. But should Real Madrid be trying to play the Red Bull style? Like I probably don't think so. You know what I mean? There's probably diminishing returns on that style as you get to the absolute peak of the sport. But for the average kind of mid-table team, I think if I was, running a team, that would be where I would go. Cause I don't know. To me, it's like all like the best kind of analytically informed strategies in sports are the ones that like when they fail, they look the worst. So people are like, when you go for it on fourth down and you don't get it, people are like, you're an idiot. Or when you
yeah,
have a game like the Rockets against the Warriors conference finals, the Rockets went like 3 for 30 from three. in one game, and it's like people watching are like, they gotta just take it to the basket, right? Like the shots aren't falling, and it's like, well, the shots won't fall if you don't keep taking them. And I think with the pressing style, right, it's like the goals you do give up look pretty terrible, right? If the press gets broken,
Yeah.
and you're going to probably have a couple of games where you get blown out by the bigger teams. But the bet you're making is that over the course of the whole season, playing this way is going to lead to more wins. And I think that's probably kind of where I would land if I was kind of the average team in Europe. I would try to build things toward that style, but then once you get higher up, I'm not sure if it would still be worth doing.
Well, that's also interesting because, and we don't necessarily have time to get into it now because we got to wrap it up. But uh, the idea of playing that way can sometimes also be dependent on not only like you have a bad day, you get exposed and you get unlucky, but how good is the opponent you're playing against? Like how
Yep.
like you brought up the Fulham example where in the second division their style of play was so dominant, and as soon as they got promoted and they kept that style of play, they just got blown out because other teams are just more talented, right? And so you can't. So
Yep.
like you might
We're
have to be
seeing it.
adaptable in that situation.
That's happening with Burnley this season so far in the Premier League too. They were, Vincent Company, Pep disciple, playing really kind of attractive soccer in the Championship, and then it's been terrible in the Premier League
Yeah,
because they have worse players than all the teams they're playing against,
yeah,
basically.
yeah. And so like I think it's pretty smart. Like I hate Getafe because I hate the way because we saw them kick the shit out of Real Madrid recently, and of course they
Yeah,
just signed Greenwood, so now I really hate them. But like
yeah, they're
they,
really digging into that
yeah,
identity.
so they're really leaning into like the villain narrative. But I remember Bordalas, like Xavi complained about Bordalas, like this is not football, like La Liga has to do something about it, and Bordalas was like, "Hey man, I could open up and try to play football against you and get destroyed. Is that what you want?" Like, so
Yeah,
like I understand that side. Like you have to like you can't just like Paco Gemes with Rayo Vallecano. This happened with Las Palmas too. They tried to play really expansive attacking football, and like they became like hipster teams. Like people liked them, but they also just got destroyed so many times.
yeah,
So like that's one thing that like I do like about Ancelotti is that he's not that rigid with like, okay, well if I'm playing against Barca or City, and it may work or may not, but like we gotta we gotta be realistic here,
yeah,
and kind of be
yeah,
adaptable.
yeah. No, and I think that's kind of why I find all this stuff interesting. Like, I don't think there'll ever be one optimal way to play soccer for all these reasons. I think we still don't really know that much about how it works, which I think is kind of a crazy thing given how popular it is. Um, but I don't think we're ever going to get to a point where it's like the NBA, where it's kind of everyone's kind of doing the same thing, and you watch a game, and it's like, for me, I still like watching the NBA, but like a lot of times I'll watch a game with a soccer game. I know which team like fundamentally played better when I watch a game. Pretty much every game I watch, right? And
Mm,
then I know that like the scoreline maybe doesn't line up with that, but I can tell who played better because you're just trying to create more chances than your opponent for the most part.
mm,
Um, with the NBA, sometimes to me, it's like I can't tell if the team played well or like if the shots just happened to go in this this night for this team. But I don't think we're ever going to get to that point with soccer because of what you're saying, right? Or because of everything we've talked about. Because the way players interact with each other will change based on the different players, based on how old those players are, and then it's not a game where um, it's not football where you have four downs and you have a very concrete objective every time you touch the ball and you can
right.
draw up plays. It's just half of the game is determined by what the other team decides to do, right?
Yeah.
Which I think makes it that's part of the reason why I love the sport so much. And I think like take Atletico Madrid for example, right? Like this title they won in 2014, right?
The league
That's like
title. Yeah.
that's like more impressive to me than Leicester winning, given that they beat Real
Mm,
Madrid and Barcelona both like while those two teams won, they were in the midst of winning back-to-back Champions League titles. Like over a league season, beating those two teams is like incredible. And then they won again, and then they have had a lot of success in the Champions League. And I think part of it comes from like they tried doing something different from everyone else, right? They had a decent amount of resources and were good at identifying players, but like they kind of made sort of defense being a good defensive team their focus, while in an era where all the other top teams were trying to be more attacking. And they've had a lot of disappointing seasons because when you play defensive soccer and it doesn't go well, it looks like shit and people get angry.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also probably provided them with the potential for those handful of title winning seasons that they had too, simply because they decided to just like try something different from everyone else.
Yeah, yeah. It makes it fascinating. Like there's so many different ways that teams have done it over the years that I think it just makes it interesting. But nevertheless,
Yeah.
well, I think all we can do is just try our best to keep trying to understand it with
Yeah.
every 1% increment that we can. I think
Exactly.
this book does a great job of it. I would encourage everyone to read it. There is actually enough winks to Real Madrid fans in this book that you won't be disappointed. There is also a good section about why Cristiano Ronaldo's scoring slump one year was just bad luck and why it normalized and he became a freak goal scorer after that. So I'll include a link in the show notes so people can go and purchase it from, I assume, Amazon, right?
Yeah, wherever you like to buy your books from is what
Beautiful.
I tell people. You can find it anywhere. So
Awesome. Ryan, thanks for your time, man. Look forward to the next book and look forward to honestly, I didn't even mean this as a dig. I was going to say next time we play Liverpool in the Champions League, but then I forgot. Next
could
year,
be
maybe.
in the Europa League this season. Who knows?
God forbid. God forbid. All right, Ryan. Thanks for your time, buddy. Good chatting.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.